Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another session of Foreign Affairs Live. We are delighted to have with us today one of America's most decorated, distinguished, and impressive soldiers, General Raymond Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, who we were delighted to have in the magazine recently, the author of a great piece in our May-June issue, The U.S. Army in a Time of Transition. And he's here today to talk with us about that piece and about various other issues of our concern. So the format will be that I'll ask the general a few questions, we'll get things going, and then for the second half we'll turn it over to you guys so that you can engage him as well. This meeting will be on the record, and it's an opportunity to speak truth to power and hear from the people who actually make the decisions that protect us and guard us and do all the other wonderful things that the Army does. So with that, General, for the few people who may not have read your piece, you talked about the three major changes that are going to be facing the force over the next decade. What do you think those are, and how will they affect the Army?
Well, a couple things. First, happy to be here. The last time I was here, I think, was in 2005. I was here with, at the time, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy Edelman, and what I remember was the night of the tree lighting ceremony, and it was about 15 minutes late because there was so much traffic. We had to actually get out of the cars and run over here. So I'm happy I'm here on time this time, so that's a good thing. What I would say is a couple things that, as the Army Chief, that I have to look at now, and I kind of talk about how I'm a dual-headed person now, because the first thing that I have to look at is I have to remind everybody that we still today have 92,000 soldiers deployed in contingency areas of operation as we sit here today. About 67 to 68,000 in Afghanistan, another 20+ thousand spread around the rest of the Middle East, and a smaller number in Kosovo, Bosnia area. So I remind everybody of that, and that doesn't include the other 90,000 forward stationed in 150 countries. So I can't ever forget about that as we walk forward, the fact that we are still significantly engaged, at least for the next several years through 2014 in Afghanistan. So I can't lose sight of that as the Army Chief. But the other thing I have to worry about is where we are going into the future and what are the kind of things that we have to look at. And to me, it's about understanding the strategic environment. And the strategic environment is changing. It's becoming more complex. And the solutions to this strategic environment are constantly changing. And so we have to think about how are we going to change with that. And so that's the basis of our thought process. So although based on the defense strategy, it says we're going to focus on the Pacific, so that specifically has an impact, there are other impacts as well in other areas of the world. So as we look to the future, I always felt that in the last 5 years, as I was working in a joint environment, either in Iraq or as the commander of Joint Forces Command, I felt that out of necessity, the Army was too internal looking because they were so focused on providing forces for Iraq and Afghanistan, we were not externally focused enough to deal with other areas around the world. So I think one of the key changes we're making is that we are becoming much more externally focused to focus on the combatant commanders and their responsibilities. And so what we're trying to do is now organize ourselves, train ourselves, and put us into a position that will better facilitate what combatant commanders are trying to do in order to shape their environment, in order to help prevent conflict, and if necessary, deploy forces to win in whatever scenario that might entail. So I think what we're now doing now is trying to, within the Army, figure out how we'll do this. So there's a couple ways we can do this. One is we have a strong foreign area officer program, but we have to support that with conventional and special operations forces that will help us to engage, build partner capacity around the world, focused with priority in the Pacific. The second thing is we have to look at our pre-positioned equipment fleets, not just for necessarily contingency operations, but for us to do multilateral training in the Pacific and other areas where we have not done that in the past. So we have to look at that. And then finally, I would tell you is what most people don't understand is today, as we sit here, there's actually 66,000 soldiers in the Pacific AOR. The problem we've had over the last 7, 8 years is they all haven't been there. We've taken them to conduct missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. So one of the first priorities I have is making sure that they remain now dedicated to the Pacific region as we shift our emphasis.
Okay. The president has said that the Army won't be sized for large-scale, protracted stability operations, and there don't seem to be any major combat operations on the horizon. So just what are you planning for with the Army, and how does that drive the size of the force?
Well, I think first off, I would say is in the 2000s, we grew the Army in order to meet the requirements that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were protracted, prolonged stability operations, which at the height of it, we had over 200,000 soldiers deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, over 200,000. And so we had to respond to that because the tempo on the all-volunteer Army was quite significant. So we increased the size of the Army. As we look to the future, as I mentioned, we have to look at the strategic environment. And what I worry about is we have to maintain a balanced portfolio within the Department of Defense, within the Joint Force, in order to deal with the great uncertainty that is out there. And as we went through this review that we did, very comprehensive review that included all the service chiefs, service secretaries, the White House, et cetera, one of the things we talked about is our ability to deal with this uncertainty. And I could give you 7, 8 different very uncertain scenarios that we have today that we have to be prepared to execute against. And if you go in the Pacific, there's uncertainty in Korea. New leader, 29 years old, trying to reassert himself, trying to establish himself. And what I worry about is not that I think he's going to go to war with South Korea tomorrow. That's not the concern. The concern is there a miscalculation? Is there a small event that could spike something larger than that? We're all watching what's going on in Syria. Iran, in my opinion, continues to be provocative in the Middle East, not only in the establishment of their nuclear program, but the way they continue to reach out with their other forces, whether it be their intelligence services, whether it be their what I would consider special operations type forces throughout the Middle East. We have the Iranian-Israeli issue. We have uncertainty, obviously, with Pakistan and how they move forward. We have uncertainty. There's a Sunni-Shia divide that we have to watch very carefully in the Middle East. And so it's about us being prepared for this uncertainty. I could talk about the fact that we're starting to see Africa, as I've learned over the last 7, 8, 9 years, the terrorist elements around the world go to the areas where they think is the least resistance. And right now, I would argue that you could argue that's Africa, where they're moving more and more capability into Africa to try to establish themselves. So we have to be careful and watch that. So it's a combination of all these things that we have to be prepared to react to if it's in our nation's interest. So in my mind, that's what we have to size ourselves to, is that.
Okay, let me press you on that. I've heard a couple of different things about the review. One, they're somewhat contradictory. One is that it was an incredibly thoughtful and serious attempt to actually make missions and budgets and coordinate them in some kind of rational way. And yet also that at the end of the day, there wasn't really any great answers to this uncertainty that you're talking about. So if you have to plan for lots of different things, but you don't know which of them is going to be the dominant thing you're preparing for, how do you actually set a size and plan a mission? Or is the budgetary envelope ultimately the thing driving?
Well, what we do is it's about capabilities. So it's about what are the right type of capabilities that you want to have. So what we do is we'll develop scenarios where we will then allocate forces in order to meet these scenarios. And so we pick 2 scenarios. And then what we do is we then compare that to other scenarios that could happen and say, do we have enough forces to do that, whether it be ground, air, sea, maritime forces. So we went into quite detail on this. And we are, as the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commanders, going through a series of strategic exercises now run by the chairman that helps us to continue to sort through this and make sure we are identifying all the issues that are out there. So we've actually gone into quite some detail even after the initial review, and we continue to do this as we move forward.
Okay, let's take an advanced budgetary question, sequestration. Over the last several months, you've said a bunch of different things on this, sometimes saying that the United States won't be able to be a global power after sequestration if it occurs, and sometimes saying, well, we will be able to, but we'll have fewer options and less capabilities.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
What exactly is it?
I mean, there's several things with sequestration. First, it is the Budget Control Act was written so it would never be executed. I mean that's the first. It was written as a forcing function to get agreement on deficit reduction and all those kind of things. And so
massive retaliation.
The parameters of the bill itself isn't very good. So if I just look at the parameters of the bill, which says every line item in the Department of Defense budget will take a 10 to 12 to 15% cut across the board, creates all kinds of chaos within our system. It would cause us to default on contracts. It would cause us to reduce end strength much quicker than we have to, which would be devastating potentially to leader development and other things for us to set up the future. So I would just argue in terms of the way it's set up itself is dangerous, because it would be just across the board cuts with no consideration for what we think is the right strategy, the right allocation of resources, et cetera. Now, if you put that aside, I would tell you that if sequestration takes into account, takes effect, I first remind everybody that we've already agreed to a $489 billion reduction over 10 years. So that doubles that reduction. And we had to go through great pains to come up with the $489 billion worth of reductions that we have. If that's doubled, which would be the case in sequestration, I think what I have said is we would have to take a completely new look at how we conduct defense strategy. The impact to the Army is a significant reduction in end strength above and beyond the 80,000 we're already taken out. It would probably be a combination reduction in the reserve and the active component. I think it would put us beyond the fringes of what I consider to be acceptable risk for us to be able to respond to this broad variety of threats. So to me, I think it's dangerous. I think we have a system in place. To look at defense budgets, sequestration is not the way and process to do it.
Given all that, is it fair to say that political dysfunction at home is a greater national security threat to the United States than anything abroad?
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is people watch what we do all the time, and they do pay attention. I was reminded of this when I was the commander in Iraq, and I would come back and testify in front of Congress on several occasions, and as I got back, I'd be critiqued by the Prime Minister and others about what he thought I said and what he thought he heard and what he thought the U.S. positions are. The reason I use that as an example is people pay attention to what we do. People pay attention to what we say, and they look to see how it impacts them. And so we always have to be mindful of that. And I think if we continue to be perceived as being in a political deadlock where we're not getting much done, I think that might be interpreted in some cases of being weak. And I think we have to be careful about that.
You mentioned Iran. You've often said that you worry about the after effects of an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program. Just what do you fear those kind of after effects would be, and are we adequately prepared for such a contingency?
Well, I mean, I think first, if there is a strike on Iran, I think they've been preparing for years to figure out what they would do in retaliation. And I don't know what they'll do. What I do know is they have the capability to conduct some level of what I would consider to be probably proxy operations in many different places, at least in the Middle East, but maybe a little bit further than that. So I think what we have to be prepared to do is ensure that any strike, whether it's us or someone else, they will blame us for the strike. And so we have to be prepared to protect ourselves when that happens. And you know, we obviously take that very seriously.
You've spent much of the last decade dealing with Iraq in various capacities. In retrospect, was the Iraq war worth it?
I get asked this question all the time. My thought is this. I think that what I learned in my time in Iraq is that I think it is a very good thing that Saddam Hussein is no longer in power in Iraq. I think there's a couple reasons why I say that. First, one is I believe his hatred for the United States would have carried on, and it's whether you believe he was dealing with terrorists back then or not, he would be by now, and the impact he might have on the stability and terrorist activities going in the Middle East, I think would be significant. The other thing that we found, though, which surprised me, was this, what I call societal devastation in Iraq that occurred probably since the last 20 years. What most people don't realize, what we should have realized more, was Iraq basically has been at war since 1980, starting with the Iran-Iraq war, then when they went into Kuwait, and then when we put in the no-fly zone, then we put in sanctions, and then we overthrew the government in 2003. And the impact on Iraq has been quite significant. And I think one of the miscalculations we made going in there is we didn't quite understand that. We didn't understand what I call the societal devastation that had been occurring for many, many years. So we underestimated the undercurrents of issues, whether it be intra-Shia issues, whether it be Sunni-Shia issues, whether it be Kurd-Sunni, Kurd-Shia issues, and the impact that this had, and the impact it's had on its leaders that are there today, what happened previously. I think we underestimated that. And so what we saw is we saw opportunists, we saw these groups who have been suppressed for so many years come out to try to establish control over Iraq. So I would just tell you, I think we're in a better place today. I wish it didn't take us 8 years to do it. I think that although Iraq is, has still lots of questions out there to be answered, I would tell you that they now are producing as much oil as Iran. I believe they will exceed that in the next couple of years. And I think ultimately it'll depend on how their political and economic system continues to move forward. And I don't think anybody can answer that question right now. And we're going to have to continue to watch that. And that's why I think it's important for us to stay engaged with the U.S. Embassy there and other. And oh, by the way, we still have about 250 or so military people on the ground to continue to advise and help them to establish a military. And I think that's important as well. I think their military made great strides. We still have strong relationships with them. We have strong relationships with their military leaders. And I think over time that will help us through many of the issues that we have to work through in the Middle East.
There have been many lessons learned after our experiences or from our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is it fair to say, looking at Libya and Syria, that the most important lesson was not to get involved in such things in the first place? Again,
I think it depends on your national interest. I think the national interests of Afghanistan and Libya are quite significantly different. So I think if you look at, I was in New York last week, and if my guess is, he's not around to ask, but if you ask Osama bin Laden in 2011 where he was and where he expected to be after the successful attacks on the Trade Center, my guess is he wouldn't have been happy with the outcome. Because you can make the argument that we've eliminated the safe havens in Afghanistan. We've had significant impact on al-Qaeda as an organization. They're not gone. They're continuing to attempt to regenerate. But I would say we've had some impact. And I think it shows in the fact that although there's been attempts, we've been pretty successful protecting the United States. And don't be fooled that we continue to be targets. And we will continue to be targets in the future.
Former Secretary of Gates said that anyone who suggested sending a big American land army into the Middle East, Asia, or Africa should have his head examined. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think, first off, I won't speak for Secretary Gates. I did have conversations with him about this afterwards. And I would say what he was trying to do is make sure that we understand that we have to begin to adjust how we do operations. And so I think that was the real message. I think nobody can predict whether we're going to have to send a ground force in somewhere in the Middle East. Now, large is a relative term. I don't know what that means. Is that 5,000, 10,000, 1,500, 200,000? I don't know what that means. But what I do know is we've not been very good at predicting the future, frankly. So what I have to be able to do is prepare to meet whatever contingency you have. But what I owe the Secretary of Defense and what I owe the President of the United States is options. And they need to be options that move along the spectrum of conflict. The only option can't be we'll just send 150,000, 200,000 American soldiers in to solve a problem. It's got to be a series of capabilities that we have that will enable us for him to use it in a sequencing fashion if that's the way he chooses to do it. So I think that's why the shift that I'm talking about on how we want to do business is important, because it then provides us other options as we move forward. And I think that's the key to what we want to try to do in the future.
In the last decade or so, there have been a number of civil-military relations issues that have come up in which there were different thinking on the part of the military, uniformed military, and the White House. Do you feel we're past that these days, or things? Can you feel free to speak your mind and feel that your professional advice and those of your military colleagues is respected, not necessarily followed blindly, but is there a real dialogue on strategic and military issues?
My experience has been there is a real dialogue, and frankly, I don't agree with what's been written about that. And I'll use the example, when we went through the administration change, I was the commander of multinational forces in Iraq at the time. And when the administration changed, the first day the president was in office, I conducted a 4-hour VTC with Ryan Crocker, who was then the ambassador of Iraq, sitting next to me, where we went through in detail where we thought we were in Iraq with the president. And then we had several different discussions over the next couple weeks. We then developed a way ahead with a strategy. I provided a paper that provided recommendations. A decision was made, and we executed the strategy. As a commander on the ground, there's nothing more that you could ask for than to present what you believe the environment is, present options, and then allow the president to select those options and move forward. There's nothing more that you can ask for. And I felt that I had access. I felt that I had the ability to express my opinion. I never felt like that my opinion was not being listened to. And now, as the Chief of Staff of the Army, frankly, I think I've had unprecedented access to the president. And it's been the case in the last 2 administrations. To be honest, I believe we've had unprecedented access to the president, and in order to discuss tough issues, whether it be in the development of the strategy or the health of the force or the way forward. So, I mean, the bottom line is our job is to provide adequate options for our national security leadership to make sound decisions. And the way we're set up is they make those decisions.
You mentioned Ambassador Crocker. Many would argue that with him on the State Department side and many of his recent partners on the military side, there's been some of the best on-the-ground collaboration between the uniformed services and the diplomatic establishment to the benefit of American national security and foreign policy. Many would also argue that that's been more the exception than the rule in a lot of respects. Have you felt, I know Secretary Gates used to say this a lot, that the non-military foreign affairs capacities of the United States are underfunded and not, frankly, as capable as the military? And so is there an over-militarization of American foreign policy due not to policy choices, but to budgetary and administrative capacity differentials?
I think that a couple things in that. I think first, whenever we get involved in issues around the world, there's got to be a strong civil-military relationship. And it's got to start with between the State Department and our combatant commanders and the relationships that they have as they work a lot of the issues. And it's got to be the right balance. And the balance that you're talking about is very different depending on what part of the world you're in my opinion. What you have to remember is some of our relationships and our relationship with countries might be more militaristic in some areas than in others. And so we have to understand that. And there's other areas where it's not. It's more diplomatic than it is militaristic. So there's not one answer, but what you have to do is be cognizant that we have to develop the right mix depending on the area. I personally do agree that the depth of our diplomatic corps is very stretched. We found that as we went into some we consider to be significant civil military operations, it was very difficult for the State Department and others in order to meet the requirements. So you could certainly make the argument that they might need to be more robust and funded a bit better to meet our needs. My concern in this area is that I think we've developed a young cadre of officers in State Department and other interagency partners that have learned to work together very closely at the tactical and operational level on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. What I worry about is we can't lose that. So we have to, as we come out of there, we have to put systems in place where we don't go back to where we were, which is the military goes this way and our diplomatic corps goes this way. So we have to work very hard at establishing processes that allows us to work together. And we can do that through exchange programs. We can do that through educational programs. I'm looking at signing, senior officers, colonels, et cetera, to the State Department so we don't lose these relationships and this cross-fertilization of expertise that we have to maintain and sustain. The thing I learned, I think a lot of us learned, is that there are limits to military power. You cannot solve every problem with military power. We all knew that, but it really came home and learned a lot of lessons with that. So it's got to be that right combination of civil military capability as you go forward. And that's what we want to try to establish. And that's why I think as we move to the Pacific, it's important that we do that, because we have not been engaging from a military, at least from a ground force perspective, in many of the countries in the Pacific. And frankly, the Pacific countries are dominated politically by their armies. And so we have to get in there and start developing relationships, because relationships can be important when you start having national security issues in many of these countries. So for us, it's important. It's for us to have a give and take with these countries. So in my mind, that's critical as we move forward.
Okay, it's actually a good lead into my next question, which is you mentioned relationships and partnerships, mill-mill partnerships, and these are a crucial part of the strategy for shifting the burden from our forces directly and for engaging different countries. Two countries that have worked closely with the United States military in a variety of contexts over the years have been Pakistan and Egypt. And there have been a lot of military relationships and a lot of partnerships and connections. And both of those countries' militaries have played a very negative role in their own countries' political developments, to the point where we're now looking at these countries as basket cases in large respects due to the military's role in their country's politics.
I would just say, I'm not sure I agree with you in the Egypt case. I would say that if we did not develop the relationships, things might have been much worse in Egypt than they are today. And I think we have to wait to watch that play out a little bit. I don't think, well, wait and see. I can't talk for the Egyptian military, but I think those relationships have paid a large dividend. I would make the argument Pakistan is the reason that we're in that problem we have now is we had a 10-year, 12-year break in that relationship. And what happened is we lost contact with now who are the senior officers. Who most of them in the past had been educated in the United States, and we built strong relationships. But this group now, except for Kiani, have not. They have not been educated because we broke off these relationships over the nuclear issue in the 90s. And so we went a long period of time without them coming and building strong military relationships. If we had done that, we might be much better off than we are now. So in my mind, you got to be careful. I'm a believer in it's never too late to talk. It's never too late to have conversations. It's never too late to build relationships. And to me, it's key as we move forward. I think the military is one way to do it.
Okay, I'll take one last question before throwing it open. You mentioned the nuclear question with Pakistan. What exactly is the role of nuclear weapons in American national security policy today? What are they good for, and how many do we need?
I will not go into too much detail, but what I would say is I think when we still have countries who have a lot of nuclear weapons. And let's put Pakistan aside. We have other countries who have lots of nuclear weapons. So I think in my mind, the strategy needs to be to attempt to continue to reduce the stockpiles of all these major countries. I think we made some progress in that lately. I think we have to continue to do that. It's a very expensive proposition to sustain nuclear weapons, but we have to work with these other major powers who still have significant nuclear stockpiles in order for us to work through the reduction of these. And I think, we have to be careful how we do that. I think we're having discussions about what is the right number, how much do we need. Some people say, do you need any? And I think that's something that we constantly have to have discussions about. But this is, in my mind, it's a very difficult unilateral decision. It's got to be based on some other countries who have this large capacity as well.
Can you imagine categories like tactical nuclear weapons being just simply eliminated from our arsenal without significant negative effect?
I mean, I would argue we've, for the most part, done that already. I actually had the opportunity to participate when I was a major in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty negotiations. And, we at that time eliminated, at least in the Army, all of our tactical nuclear weapons. So frankly, we've done that already. Here's the concern is, for us, is as some of these other nations develop nuclear weapons, will they be afraid to use them? And to me, that's the bigger issue. If you have a nuclear weapon in, is North Korea or in Iran, will they not be afraid to use them? Because that to me could be real dilemmas. And I think to me, that's something we have to be more concerned about as we look forward. Some nations who might not be as concerned about using nuclear weapons. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out right now.
Okay, last question, actually, that triggers one more, which is presumably dealing with those kinds of questions, thinking through what deterrence means in an uncertain future with multiple different powers, requires a lot of intellectual capability. There have been some concerns raised in the last few weeks about the Army's and the military's attitude towards this, given some recent actions at NDU and possible future places, about what role military intellectuals have in today's armed forces. Are the cutbacks there a sign that the senior command today doesn't respect military intellectuals?
Well, I'm not going to speak for NDU, but I'm not going to speak to that specifically. Let me talk in general terms. First off, I would argue where I'm moving in the Army is more towards developing intellectual capacity in several different ways. The assumption is that when we make reductions, whether we make a change at the Army War College or the National War College, that we're saying we're reducing it, we're against intellectual capability. We might be trying to reorganize ourselves to make it better, where we can develop more capability and more ability for us to think about problems in the future. Because here's what I found, and I know you'll all be shocked at this, but once the Army or any military service, it's like turning an aircraft carrier. It takes forever to change. And so we have to make some changes. The world is changing. The world is becoming more complex. We have to change with it. And so we're going to have to change, in my mind, some of the intellectual thought processes that we have. It's not about eliminating it or reducing it. It's about maybe changing it and looking at things a bit differently. So in my mind, that's one of the things. So, for example, one of the things that we're looking at now in the Army is we've always been involved in what we call the physical domain of land domain, physicality of the land domain. In my mind, that's important, but now what is becoming more and more important is the virtual domain in cyberspace. And how does land domain and cyber domain interact with each other? And in order for us to continue to influence the human domain, which is somewhere in between the virtual domain and the physical domain. And so that's intellectually stimulating. We need people to think about those kind of things because the world's changing. So we got to think about those kind of, there's nothing set up right now to think about things like that. So we have to look at stimulating thought that brings us forward so we can better predict what we might have to do in the future to sustain our security. So
if you have good people who think about those things, send them my way at Foreign Affairs, and we'll publish them happily.
Right.
With that, let me throw it over to our audience and bring them in. Please, when I call on you, wait for the microphone, stand, state your name, and ask a single, concise question. Yes, over here.
General, this was really terrific. Thank you very much. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School, and as you know, the Zabrowski Institute, with which I'm connected, is sort of thinking about the future of the Army. I actually have two questions. One is, with the troops that are moving from the Mideast to the Pacific, what kind of education and training are they going to get about the new context in which they are living? And do you think there's a chance that we can basically, on a worldwide basis, get rid of drones the way we got rid of gas after World War II? I have too many friends that are worried about drones over Washington as they become commodities.
Mitzi is the last person I will allow to ask two questions.
First, what we're doing in the Army is we have this thing called the Army Force Generation Process. And it was developed in the mid-2000s to prepare forces to go to Iraq, basically to prepare forces to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. So what we're now doing is, starting next year a little bit, but mostly in 2014, we are shifting that process. We will then align forces who go through this process to the different combatant commands. As part of that process, they will go through they will become connected to certain areas of the world, and they will, thank you, and they will continue to learn culturally, understand the context where they have to operate in. That's the intent. So we want to address it in that way. I think the drone issue is a very complex issue. I think that first, limiting drones is not a good idea, in my opinion. Now, we can limit it being used in the United States. I mean, that's a different issue. From my perspective, we use them in other areas. And so there's a couple things you have to think about is, okay, do we want drones to be used to lethally? Or do we really want drones to be used to collect intelligence? Or do we want them to be used to collect intelligence and do lethal operations? And that's what we have to figure out as we move forward. The issue with drones is, you know, it's not a significantly complex technology. And so one of the things I worry about as we look to the future is our counter drone capability. You know, and what do we have to do in order to counter drones as they are developed by other countries? And so to me, that's something that we have to really take a look at. And we have a lot of work to do in that area. You know, when I was in Iraq, we shot a couple drones down, Iranian drones, but it was purely by accident. I mean, not by accident, but it was lucky. I mean, I'll put it that way.
Yes, over here.
Alan Wendt. General, could you comment on the evolving situation in the South China Sea, how U.S. interests are affected, and what kind of contingency planning we're undertaking to deal with the situation?
Well, it's developing, as you know, as we sit here, it continues to develop. It's been one that I know the PACOM commander has been very concerned about for a while. And so, you know, this has to do with us. You know, they've had some conversations lately about the law of the sea and all that, and that plays a role in this as we move forward. And do we want to implement it? Do we not want to implement? But that does play a role in this, is making sure we get rules in place to deal with issues like this. Right now, they're, you know, as non-signature, it's somewhat of an issue for us. So that's part of this. The other part of this is the vulnerability that many of the countries out there feel in protecting what they believe to be their own assets. So you can argue about that, and so what we have to figure out is how do we reach out and help them to deal with these issues. And so it's a combination of both those. There's some law of the sea issues we got to work. It's about how we continue to reach out and work with these nations to work with them on what they're trying to do, and then obviously working with China and influencing China. So this is the kind of thing this is why we're refocusing towards Asia, because we have to do more in those three areas. I didn't answer your question specifically, but those are the kind of things that we have to do. And what's interesting, I think some of the actions are actually driving a lot of these nations towards us, which is something that we have to decide and take advantage of and see what we're going to do.
Yes, right here. You.
It's easy.
Hold on 1 sec. 1 sec.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Dale from the Congressional Research Service. General Odierno, great to see you, and thanks for taking time to engage with all of us. You mentioned at the beginning building partnership capacity. Partnership, the term, has been used rampantly, increasingly so, kind of like the flavor of the year. But the trick is that very often we don't talk about what the ends of partnership are, or how to prioritize partnership activities, or how to assess the effectiveness of the results. In fact, sometimes it seems like partnership is an end in itself. Could you say a few words, please, about the Army's role in partnership and how that helps actually carry out defense strategy and protect U.S. interests? Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. Partnership is used in a variety of terms. When we talk about, I characterize this in shaping the future environment. And so that's how I characterize it. So what does the Army do? So let me take the Pacific, or let me either Pacific or AFRICOM as good examples of this. So I would argue that, as I've written, is 22 out of 27 chiefs of defense in the Pacific are Army. 7 out of 10 largest armies in the world are in the Pacific. So what we want to do is build a strong partnership from top to bottom. So what I have to do as the Chief of Staff of the Army is prioritize those countries which we think are important to have strong engagements with, staff talks at the high level. And then we also have to look at what do we think the emerging nations might be 5 to 10 years from now to establish relationships with them. So that's at the high level. But what we also have to do is at the more tactical level, we have to work with younger officers from these nations, because in 10 years from now, they will be the senior officers. And so what we want to do is tactically work with them so we start to build bonds and relationships at the very lowest level. Why do we want to do this? Well, first, it's to have mutual trust, and that's important. And we talked about Pakistan, in fact, that we have a trust problem with Pakistan right now. But we want to build mutual trust that will live over time. It's about access, potentially. If we might need access, it helps us to develop the relationships in order to gain access under mutual agreement. So I think ultimately those are the kind of things that we have to do. People sometimes think, well, how does that work by just having a platoon on the ground? Well, it's the beginning of establishing long relationships. Sometimes it's not even having a platoon. It might be having a medical team on the ground. It might be having engineers on the ground that help us to start to build this level of trust that in my mind is essential. So that's what we have to do. And that then enables us to gain influence. It enables us to build a partnership that will allow us to deal with future difficult issues in these nations. So I mean, that's how I look at it as we go forward. And what I want to do is, we'll provide right and left limits for the USARPAC commander, for example, so he can choose what is the best avenue to do this. I don't want to be directing to him, this is what you must do with this country. But what I want to do is make sure we stay coordinated at the senior level down through the operational and tactical level.
Is the implication of that mil-mil contacts should not be a political football that are turned on and turned off like a rheostat with different changes?
I think we have to be careful. I mean, I understand why it happens. And I think it's sometimes when countries don't do what we want, the first thing we want to do is cut off monies and other things that were given to them. And that tends to be through some of the military engagements that we have. But I think we have to be careful about that, because I think although short term that might help, in the long term it might hinder us. So I always am very careful when I get asked that question in Congress to make sure they understand the long-term implications of doing something like that if we decide to do that. It is important. You don't want to turn it on and off. That's the trust issue.
Yes, in the very back there. Very back. You'll get the next one. In the very back there.
General, Tony Bertuca from InsideDefense.com. Thank you for being with us.
Sure.
The Secretary of Defense has recently told the Army in the strategic guidance that one of your new focuses, or you're going to revisit the counter-WMD mission. Can you tell us a little bit about how you expect the Army to execute that mission and what kind of resources will be driven toward it? Thank you.
We can tell you, but we have to kill you.
No, one of the things I'll talk about in general terms. One of the things we're working is, in February I did soft Army talks. So I went down to SOCOM headquarters, brought my staff, they had their whole staff. And this is part of this initiative. I'm working very hard to develop how we build on the relationships between special operations forces and ground forces that have been established in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it goes across a plethora of issues, to include building partner capacity in some areas, to build training foreign forces. But it also gets to the WMD issue, that we will develop scenarios that ensures that the Army, with our capabilities, are jointly synchronized with our special operations forces, if needed, to counter WMD, or to make sure that the WMD does not get into the hands of people we don't want it to be in. And so we're working that. We are really moving forward with this. Just this last month, we had our largest, out at Fort Polk, Louisiana, we just had our largest training exercise in a very long time between special operations forces and conventional forces. And we have these planned throughout the year to work issues such as this. And in the future, I would foresee us doing a rotation that deals with WMD specifically, and how we might deal with that and what the different scenarios will be. So it's about building the synergy between these capabilities that have been built. That's important. And that's what we're really trying to do. And we're trying to do that among all the services. But in this case, it's really Special Operations Force and Ground Force who are trying to work this issue.
Okay. Yes.
General, thank
1 second. Wait for your mic.
General, thank you for being here. Randy Lieberman is my name. Question about our relationship with two countries and where it is now and where is it going, specifically Turkey and Vietnam.
Well,
I'll let it slide.
Turkey is, in my mind, a very important country for us. Turkey is really one who looks west a bit towards NATO as a NATO partner, but is very much involved in what goes on east. And so it's important for us to continue to have strong relationships with Turkey. Their relationships, they have diverse relationships in the Middle East, whether it be with Iran, Iraq, Syria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they're a NATO partner. So for me, that makes it incredibly important for us to have very strong relationships with our Turkish friends. And so it's important for us. And so I think what that helps us to solidify, so what I used to talk about when I was a commander in Iraq, we have a strong relationship with Turkey, we have a good relationship with Iraq, we have a good relationship with Kuwait. We now have a line of cooperation that we might have that would be very significant for us right in the center of the Middle East. And we can't lose that. And Turkey's a major player in that. Vietnam, I think, is one where we continue to build relationships. I think we're moving in that direction. If you ask me a country in 5 to 10 years that could be significant, I think that might be one. So I think that's one of the ones we're probably looking at to begin to build our relationships. So in 5 to 10 years, when we think they will become even more prominent, that we're prepared to have a strong relationship with them to deal with issues in Southeast Asia.
Does that freak you out a little bit?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I understand it better now than I probably did 10 years ago, mainly because I directed us to deal with many insurgents in Iraq that if you'd asked me initially, I would have told them there's no way I would ever deal with them. But that's, at the end of any conflict, you got to come to resolution. And you got to then decide, what you're going to do with countries and how it's in your best interest and what's in their best interest. And I think in this case, that's what we have to do.
In the back there, yes.
Hello, my name is Uroš Piper. I'm correspondent of Serbian National Tanjug News Agency. My question is on Western Balkan states. As you mentioned earlier, there are still American soldiers in Kosovo and Bosnia. And a few days ago, we've seen that Kosovo Prime Minister Hashim Thaçi says that supervised independence of Kosovo will be cancelled on July 2nd, and that Kosovo will go ahead without supervision of international community. My question is, do you think that that's a good move if we know that there are still violence on northern Kosovo and there are still unresolved question of Kosovo's independence at least regarding Serbia? Thank you, sir.
I'm not specifically aware with that announcement, so I'll just start off by saying that I was not tracking that. What I will say though is that's still a very key piece of area, and we have to make sure that we continue to have stability in that region. I think it's key as we move forward. And so we want to work with all sides. I just had a meeting with the Chief of Defense, the Serbian Army, Chief of the Army, Serbian Army was here to see me. And I think there's we're working very closely with them, building new relationships with them. As you know, we continue to work with Kosovo on this. So in my mind, we want this is something we've spent an awful lot of time and effort here, and we want to make sure we continue to move forward in the right direction. And there's still some issues, as you are very well aware, underneath that cause some problems. So in my mind, I think we have to go very carefully. Right now, we're still going to have forces in there to continue to help as we move forward. And we have to wait and see. I mean, it's kind of a wait and see approach, and we'll continue to look at it very carefully as we go forward.
Yes, right here.
Afternoon, sir. Tony Atler, Rand Corporation. Just wondering, can you talk briefly on how you see the role of the Army within the AirSea Battle concept and anti-access in general?
Yeah. I mean, first, what I look at, what I'm looking at is the Joint Operational Access Capability, the JOAC, which is being developed by the Joint Staff. And so we're operating under that. AirSea Battle is part of that. You know, and AirSea Battle is addressing an issue that we need to address. A squared AD, you know, so it's important that we're doing that. The Army has a role. We have somebody in the office working with them. I believe the Army has a role in that. I also believe that we just did a large exercise, a forced entry exercise down at Fort Bragg with 18th Airborne Corps and 82nd Airborne Division to continue to look at how we might have to do forcible entry access at lower levels in order to get access. So there's many things that we have to continue to work through here. But I think we've identified an area. We have to identify what is the investments we want to make, what is the right balanced strategy for air, sea, ground forces. And I think we're still working through this. I think AirSea Battle is a start. But I think there's still a lot of work that we have to do to bring this concept to fruition, to understand where the investments go, where they don't go. But area denial is how we come against that. And assured access is important to us. We need them to enable us, so if necessary, we can put ground forces on the ground, and we need to do that through assured access. So in my mind, it's important strategy, but we have a lot of work to do yet. And we got to figure out where the technological investments we're going to make. We got to figure out what the balanced approach is, where each service plays, and we're working very closely with them. The joint oversight of this is important because it's got to become a joint concept, and now it is. And we now got it under a joint concept, and we'll continue to work our way through there. And I'm very pleased that we're working it now in that context.
Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Shirley from China Central Television. And you emphasize the shift from Asia Pacific, and especially China is playing a very important role in this area. So in the past few months, the Philippine issues and also South China Sea, they're also involving China. So how do you evaluate the relationship with the U.S. Army with China? So do you mean that the U.S. Army is involving more conflicts with China indirectly?
Well, I think we're still working it. We're not where we want to be with the relationship with China. We have opened up the United States. We just had one of the leaders of the Chinese Defense Department over here who went and visited several of our installations. So we're trying to open up so they understand what we're doing. It's important that we get over to China and continue to work and understand where they're headed. When you have two major powers, transparency is important. We're not quite there yet. So what we want to work towards is transparency, and I think transparency will help us to solve a lot of the issues that could occur. So, to me, that's the most important thing that we want to try to work as we move forward. China is, I think China could be a great partner in the United States, but we got to continue to work that from a military perspective. so we understand what they're trying to do, they understand what we're trying to do, we develop some transparency so there's no miscalculation. So I think that's important.
Yes, over here.
Thank you, General Odierno, for being with us here today and also for your service in Iraq. The question I have for you is, you've talked a lot about mil-mil cooperation on a bilateral basis, and I'd like to get your thoughts on the future of multilateral security cooperation in a multilateral framework, given that one of the major frustrations of the United States government over the past decade has been burden sharing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so where do you see multilateral security cooperation headed in an age of austerity? Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, thanks for bringing that up, actually. And I really should be talking more in a multilateral context. So I didn't mean to give the impression it's bilateral. It's probably based on the kind of questions I got. But you're exactly right. It is about multilateral operations. So there's a couple things that we're doing. Even though the Army is reducing its size in Europe, we're gonna allocate forces that allow us to continue to do multilateral training with our NATO partners. What shouldn't be lost on anybody, although maybe we can argue that some of the percentage of defense spending in NATO has gone down, over the last several years now, they have decided that they will conduct operations outside of Europe. And I know that's been 15, 16, 18 years now. But that's important. And so we got to make sure we continue to do the multilateral training with them, so as we have mutual interests, we can use NATO as a method to do burden sharing and deploy on our mutual interests. I think in the Pacific region, we're working with the Australians, where we can do multilateral training. One of the concepts we're looking at is we put pre-position equipment there. Again, it's not approved. We haven't agreed to it yet, but put equipment there and then bring countries from around the region in to begin multilateral efforts. And it's important to Australia, it's important to us, and it's important to those nations. So those are the kind of things we're doing. Same in Africa. We're looking at doing multilateral efforts in Africa as well. And I think that's going to be more and more important as we go forward. And so it is about building this multilateral capability and structure necessary in order to, again, as I said earlier, build confidence, build trust, and then maybe have access. And that's the method that we want to use, is a multilateral aspect. We have a lot of work to do in that in the Asia Pacific. We have strong, as everybody knows, we have strong relationship with Korea, strong relationship with Japan. We have some work going on in the Philippines, and other places, but we got to really get in. And we have good relationships with other countries, such as Thailand and others, but it's a multilateral effort that is going to be important in the future.
General, we only have a couple minutes left. You've covered a vast range of topics. Let me take the last question and have you just go a little personal for a sec. You've had an extraordinary career. And as you've gone through the ranks and as you've assumed different commands and been in different situations, I'm curious, how is your perspective on, you've talked about a vast range of issues from grand strategic to tactical to everything. How has your attitude on these kinds of issues evolved and changed over the course of your various
well, it's changed a lot. I mean, I think, first, just by your own experiences, you change your thought process a lot. But one of the things that there's a couple things that I've learned as I've gotten in more important leadership positions is there's three things that I always base things on. Is first, you have to have a vision on where you want to go, but you have to be able to lead change because change is constant. Now, we're talking about an Army in transition here, but the Army has been changing and transitioning ever since I've been in it. And so you have to understand how you do change. And I think I've learned that over time, the importance of change, the importance of leading change, the importance that our leader development capability plays. And then the last thing is you have to constantly learn. You can never stop learning. You have to take varying opinions. You have to challenge maybe some of your own basic assumptions as you go forward. And it doesn't mean you have to accept all varying opinions, but you certainly need to listen to them. Because in my mind, it helps you to better shape the right solutions. And even, one of the things we've learned is you got to look at the United States from other people's eyes as well. Because what we think we might be portraying might be completely different than what others are portraying. So it's things like that that have helped me. And that's why one of the things I'm truly emphasizing is how we adjust our leader development programs in the Army. I think the Army's always had a very strong leader development program. We develop leaders. But the environment that we're going to operate in, the complexity of it, and what we're going to ask them to do requires, in my mind, some changes to how we do leader development. And it's about, it's about broadening their thought process. It's about giving them opportunities that they're able to execute not just the military capabilities that they learn early on as a military officer, but how you get to think operationally and strategically, and how you're able to understand the dynamics and the impact that U.S. military power can or cannot have in very specific situations. So in my mind, that's what I've learned. And I think, as you get older and as you experience more things, again, I think you start to change your thought process on how to solve problems, or at least how to identify problems, and then come up with the right solutions. So,
General, thank you very much. Thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Great job. Great job.